My recent trip to the Isle of Man started with a bus ride from Belfast to the Dublin airport. If you didn't know, the Isle of Man is a self-governing British Crown dependency, and it is not part of the United Kingdom. If you're ever in Ireland, I definitely recommend trying some Tayto crisps. Fun fact, there is a brand of Tayto in the south of Ireland and also a brand of Tayto in the north of Ireland. I prefer the Tayto crisps in the north of Ireland. I finally made it to the Isle of Man, and I was a bit disappointed that I was not offered a passport stamp. So I asked for one, and silly me, it didn't even occur to me that I now have a novelty passport stamp in my official passport. So hopefully that doesn't cause me any issues in the future. Believe it or not, this right here was my Airbnb for the duration of my stay. This was in a little town on the Isle of Man called St. Mark's. And this was an old schoolhouse that stopped operating in the 1960s. It's owned by the church right next door to the schoolhouse, and the Airbnb is run by volunteers. It was definitely interesting staying right next to a cemetery, and it was at about this time on the first day of my trip that I was realizing just how far away I was from any and all tourist attractions on the Isle of Man, and if I'm being honest, there aren't that many. But fortunately, I decided that I would just have to take a taxi into Douglas on the first full day of my trip, so that's what I did. My first stop was Starbucks for some breakfast. Sometimes you have to stick with what you know. Then I made my way over to the Isle of Man's Welcome Center. I was able to ask plenty of questions about navigating the island, and I left feeling significantly more confident about what exactly I was going to do on the Isle of Man. I was even able to get some postcards to send my family. After leaving the Welcome Center, I started to make my way towards the electric railway, and I spotted this statue of the Bee Gees, which I found interesting because on my recent trip to Manchester, there was a lot of talk about the Bee Gees. So it seems like everybody wants to claim the Bee Gees. I also noticed a statue paying tribute to fallen service members. I thought this was interesting because on my taxi ride that morning, my taxi driver was explaining to me how it's true that the British military has an obligation to come to the defense of the Isle of Man. And even though men on the Isle of Man cannot be drafted into the British military, lots of men from the Isle of Man have volunteered and died on behalf of the United Kingdom. So he was sure to make that very clear to me. I took the electric railway from Douglas to Laxey, and my first stop was the Laxey wheel. What I did not realize, though, was that it was going to require a literal hike to get there, but I made it, and it was a beautiful sight on a very beautiful day. The Laxey wheel is the world's largest working water wheel. It was built in 1854 to pump water from the Great Laxey Mine, and the nickname for the Laxey wheel is Lady Isabella. Obviously, Lady Isabella is still standing today, and the wheel serves as a symbol of the Isle of Man's rich industrial heritage. After visiting the Great Laxey Wheel, the next thing on my list was taking the Snaefell Mountain Railway line, which is a historic electric tramway that has been transporting visitors since 1895 to the summit of Snaefell, which is the highest peak on the Isle of Man. Once we made it to the summit, someone made the comment that it looked a lot like a continuation of Snowdonia National Park, which is in Wales. And I found that comment very interesting because I had just recently visited Snowdonia National Park and I was thinking the exact same thing. It looked very similar. After spending some time at the summit, I had to take the Snaefell Mountain Railway back to Laxey and then switch to the electric railway line to make my way back to Douglas for a fish and chips dinner and ultimately make my way back to my Airbnb. My first full day on the Isle of Man was a success, and by day 2, I knew the drill. Once again, I took a taxi to the capital city of Douglas. I was blessed with another beautiful day on the Isle of Man, and my first stop of the day was the Manx Museum. The museum started with quite a bit of interesting art and a lot of nautical themed art, which makes sense because it is an island. One interesting thing I learned about the Isle of Man is that people are not only interested in folklore, but they also tend to be a bit superstitious. For example, my Airbnb host said that on the Isle of Man, they typically don't say the word R-A-T. And she also mentioned to me that on the island there were fairies. And at first I found this kind of comical because I was thinking of the passenger vessels and I thought to myself, well, of course the Isle of Man has fairies. But no, she was actually talking about little Tinkerbell fairies. Another thing that's very popular on the Isle of Man is the annual TT race, which stands for Tourist Trophy. This is not something that I had any previous knowledge about, but I did learn that it is something that is quite dangerous. It is something that is very popular on the Isle of Man, and I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of interested in eventually witnessing the TT for myself someday. The Manx Museum ended up being fantastic, and it also had an awesome gift shop. My next stop of the day was supposed to be the Isle of Man Parliament building, which is called Tynwald. Unfortunately, they only allow public visitors to roam around the inside on Mondays and Fridays. I went on a Thursday. This was pretty disappointing to me because the Isle of Man has the oldest parliament in the world with an unbroken existence, and I was excited to learn a bit more about it, but I just went on the wrong day. So I had to skip to my next activity of the day, the steam train. At Douglas Station, I ran into one of my good old friends, Barney. I decided that I had spent enough time in Douglas and it was time for me to hop on the steam train and go south to Castletown. The steam train was really spacious and pleasant, but I could not believe how many people left their luggage at the station. Unfortunately, I only had 2 hours to spend in Castletown because I had to catch the last steam train back to Douglas for the day. Fortunately, though, 2 hours was the perfect amount of time to grab some lunch and explore Castle Rushen. I have been very fortunate to get to see a number of different castles throughout my travels, but I will say that Castle Rushen was truly spectacular and impressive. In more recent centuries, Castle Rushen did serve as a prison, and as you will see, someone working for the castle nowadays has a sense of humor. Yeah, it was interesting and shocking enough to have found one of the castle, we'll just say restrooms, but then to have found a second restroom that was occupied. I was not expecting that. Even a little bit of rain could not keep the Isle of Man from being an absolutely pleasant place, and it was so nice to have so much space on the steam train. Once I made it back to Douglas, I was on a mission to try the Isle of Man's national dish for dinner, Queenies or Queen scallops. Fortunately, I did find some and they were so good. They were served with bacon, they were in this creamy sauce, and they were also served on brown bread. So that was a great dinner, but now it's bingo time. Not only is bingo simply something that I enjoy, but I think it's pretty cool that I can say I have played it in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Glasgow, Scotland, Manchester, England, Florida, USA, and now on the Isle of Man. I ended up getting a full house, which means that I not only won 40 pounds, but I was finally able to see for myself an Isle of Man banknote. The Isle of Man does have its own currency called the Manx pound. It is worth just as much as a pound from the UK. And while you can use pounds from the UK on the Isle of Man, you cannot use Manx pounds in the UK. My final full day on the Isle of Man was definitely a success, and just check out that gorgeous view. On the final morning of my trip, it was time for me to say goodbye to the old schoolhouse and make my way to the airport. My solo trip to the Isle of Man was definitely pretty challenging, but I will say that it really helped me build my confidence as a solo traveler. And of course, no trip is complete without a new sticker on my suitcase. So, see ya, Isle of Man. Time to go back to Ireland.